first day showed that NUS has pulled off an amazing event. And Umakan Verital, as the chair, has been thanking everyone, but he's done so much work, so I think the best way to start day 2 is just a hand for Umakan. And of course, it's always repeated at GCGC, but Elaine, organizer extraordinaire, and Marco and all of ECGI as well have just pulled this off in a wonderful way. The administrative announcement is Umakan, he had a wonderful dinner speech, but he made a tiny little error in his speech. The southern ridge is actually closed for refurbishment, so he told me to tell everyone, please do not go up to the southern ridge. You may fall off it. So you can go to McRitchie instead. And he told me to make sure to tell you that his second warning about monkeys holds. And if you indulge me for 30 seconds, I had personal experience of this with Jill, Eric, Dorothy, and Georg. And we were on the McRitchie path, and I was taking a picture, and Eric said, Dan, there's a monkey behind you. And if you know Eric, I just thought, sure, I'm not a sucker. There's no monkey behind me. And then he said, Dan, there's a monkey behind you. And I still didn't look, yeah. But the third time, I was like, okay, I'm going to look. Lo and behold, the monkey wanted some private benefits of control. And he went for my, I had my phone out, so he's probably targeting my phone. So do take heed, yeah, if you do go to McRitchie, that you need to protect your items. With that, we're right on time. It just turned 10 o'clock. And so I will not take any more of your time, just to say that we have a super exciting first session, a paper by Mariana, who wrote another excellent paper in this conference, and Elizabeth, and Elizabeth will be presenting. It's called Engines of External Governance. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. Yeah, it's extraordinary to be here, and thank you to all of our hosts and organizers at NUS. You are the rock stars of Singapore. And thanks to ECGI and everyone involved in GCGC, and again, in advance for your discussion. Sitting at dinner last night, I was so reminded that it was friends from all around the world and how meaningful getting to be a part of GCGC has been. It's so nice to have this meaningful time across years even of research and friendship. So this paper is co-authored with Mariana, as mentioned, and we've titled it Engines of External Governance. It's forthcoming, but we haven't started the editing process yet, so it's a truly wonderful time for us to discuss it. Thank you. And this paper we aim to help understand who is shaping corporate governance. And of course, there's much focus on these actors, and many additional have been identified as part of what Dorothy Lund and I have described as the corporate governance machine, and what Mariana has discussed in the rise of international corporate law. And this paper that Mariana and I are working on focuses on another, nonprofits. And the more we've looked into nonprofits and their involvement in shaping for-profit corporate governance, we've seen that they've played a role in many significant developments. There are multiple interactions that are occurring, in part catalyzed or aided by efforts of nonprofits. And when we started to look at many of the developments that have been discussed by research papers and in business law and finance of the past bunch of years, we realized that many of those had nonprofits involved in those developments, even if they hadn't been papers focused on nonprofits. So we really wanted to add this focus, a meta paper in a sense, collecting a study of what's going on with nonprofits in the corporate governance world. Of course, there are multiple interactions between nonprofits and for-profit corporate governance. Our paper is not so broad as that. So we acknowledge, for example, that numerous business corporations like ExxonMobil and JP Morgan and Coca-Cola, they have established corporate foundations to conduct philanthropic activities. And some business corporations, of course, are controlled by nonprofits like Hershey's, IKEA, Novo Nordisk, OpenAI. Our focus, by contrast, in this paper is on nonprofits that at first glance often seem less directly related to corporations, but they've been involved in shaping a number of corporate governance developments, like the types of things that you see here. And we're studying how nonprofits aim to shape for-profit corporate governance of business corporations, and there's some trade associations, types of nonprofits that are known in the corporate governance machine like these. So these are very familiar, I think, to many in this space. But there are just so many more, and that's why we thought doing this project could help us understand and bring attention to what's going on with this phenomenon. So this paper aims to try to make 3 primary contributions. First, we document the influence of nonprofits in helping shape the corporate governance developments of the last decades. We identify the range of nonprofits in corporate governance advocacy, and we explore their features that's driving their involvement. Second, we identify and try to investigate the 4 main elements of the strategic playbook that nonprofits often use in trying to shape for-profit corporate governance. And then third, we explore the implications that flow from recognizing nonprofits as these engines of external governance. And I'll certainly say more about each of these 3. So let's dig into that first part. The first part, it addresses 2 sets of questions for trying to understand nonprofits shaping corporate governance. The first set of questions concerns the rationale for why would some of this activity be happening through nonprofits. Now, we're not saying that all of this activity happens through nonprofits. Of course, much of it happens through individuals or business corporations, but a whole bunch happens through nonprofits, so why would that be? That's the question we're trying to answer first. And as to individuals and organizations, we point out that organizations have certain features. Some of them are well recognized in the literature on entityness, but some things we think are also specifically important in this context that we identify to nonprofits. What do you get by acting through a nonprofit instead of in your individual capacity? Things like continuity. So when you think about corporate gadflies in the US, you might think of somebody like Evelyn Davis. She had an amazing career of being a corporate gadfly, or so-called one, for half a century. But that's still limited in time, and organizations can operate for much longer periods of time, which we see with examples like Oxfam and others. Also, the scale. Oxfam's another great example of this. One organization might have a whole structure across the world and have an enormous scale through its operations. The legitimacy of acting through an organization may be important in some instances. Sometimes there can even be a halo effect or other things that flow from acting as an organization. And also the anonymity, the opaqueness that can arise because you're acting through a corporate name instead of an individual one. For-profits versus nonprofits, again, we're not saying that this doesn't happen through for-profits, but it's why would there also be activity through nonprofits? We draw upon theories of nonprofits from Weisbrod and Hansman in this regard, adding to the understanding of why some people would choose to do this through the nonprofit form. And we turn to also think about why would nonprofits be doing this instead of whatever is the underlying purpose of their nonprofit in some sense. That is, you could think like, why does Greenpeace focus on corporate governance instead of just environmental matters? That's the kind of question we mean here. And we have a number of ideas on what might be happening in that regard. Growing skepticism about the feasibility of government solutions, governance gaps across the world produced by globalization. I think this one is really important. Sometimes I think part of what's going on is that if you just look at the 100 largest corporations in the world, you could imagine if we could just influence those top 100 corporations, that would be making big impact around the world. And I think that's a lot of what many nonprofits start to think about. Also, there's been an increase in shareholder power, which makes the tool of acting in this way through corporate governance more feasible in some instances. The other part of that first part of the paper is mapping the organizations that we're talking about. And we're asking basically what are the key features, how are they similar, and how do they vary? And our goal here is not to establish rigid categories or taxonomies, but to examine the notable contrasting features across a diverse spectrum of nonprofits. And we acknowledge this is a meta or lumping paper, Mariana will sometimes say. These vary widely. We know that. These are in some ways apples and oranges. If you're like Shareholder Commons and Oxfam, these are very different organizations. And that's part of the project is actually what can we learn by bringing them together. So in this section, we're observing various things about these characteristics when we map them. And one thing we noted is that old organizations in this space, they date back to the first half of the 20th century. But we observe that many are creations of the 21st century, and that's a trend line that's generally been observed to be occurring with the increase in number of nonprofits. We note a few different kind of ways of thinking about their differences. The timing of creation is noted. Also, the purpose and degree of specialization. This is a point about whether the organization itself has a primary focus of influencing corporate governance. So some of these organizations, like Oxfam or Greenpeace, et cetera, they started for different purposes, but in a sense, they pivoted some of their focus towards trying to achieve their goals through shaping corporate governance. While some of these organizations were actually formed quite expressly for purposes of doing things in the corporate governance space, like B-Lab, et cetera. And then further, the geographical reach. So some, from a US perspective, we'd say are domestic, and some are international in their reach. While some nonprofits, like America First Legal, they maintain a purely US domestic focus. Many of the organizations that we studied, we realized more and more as we looked into them, operate across different jurisdictions. And some of them are not even single entities, but they're rather groups of nonprofits. So taken together, this mapping tries to underscore that nonprofits intervening in corporate governance, they vary systematically across some salient dimensions. When they emerge, how centrally governance figures in their missions, whether they operate domestically or transnationally, it's a large spectrum of actors. Part 2, the strategic playbook. So a few things here. We identify 4 main strategies. And of course, many of us have read papers in any one of these categories. We've read many papers on shareholder proposals. You may have read papers on climate litigation or whatnot. So what we think we're adding value on here is to identify the multiple strategies that are being used. And once you do that, you can see that many of these nonprofits are not just focused on one strategy. They use multiple strategies, and there's an interaction of the strategies. You can also see how nonprofits of different political or ideological views will be using the very same strategies. So for example, lobbying for legislation on disclosure becomes potentially more meaningful for fostering accountability and market-based pressure when combined with litigation or public shaming. And studying these strategies with both kind of micro and macro lenses reveals the sheer volume of impact that often just goes unnoticed, and that it can be traced to nonprofits. There's also a broader pattern that we started to see when we were studying this of snowballing effects and efforts at hardening legal obligations around the world. And you really see this with legislation like supply chain legislation, benefit corporations. And we also notice how nonprofits often help catalyze a chain reaction of rising trends as well as their backlash with things like ESG and anti-ESG. Similarly with litigation, the battleground topics of recent litigation include those at the heart of kind of US culture wars, but the legal hooks for these disputes, they often reside in traditional corporate governance frameworks like derivative suits about fiduciary duties or board composition rules or disclosure rules or securities class actions. And on shareholder proposals, while many studies focus on individuals, so-called gadflies or special interests, a focus on nonprofits helps shed light on how they're often generating opposing forces within the same public company. And those efforts are often part of larger strategies of influence that don't rely exclusively on shareholder proposals at all. Also, nonprofits are laboratories for corporate governance ideas, and they use the shareholder proposal mechanism often for innovation and impact, whether it's destaggering boards or exploring new theories like portfolio theory for shareholders holding the market, and so on. This fourth category of the playbook, we're putting a bunch of things in here that are this other forms of activity like advising, consulting, collaborating. I think standard setting and codes of conduct are particularly notable. We've seen things like SASB, GRI, the CPA-Zicklin Index, and so on having significant influence, white papers and public campaigns, and so on. So that's part 2. So let's move to part 3 of the paper. So part 3, we are exploring the implications, and we do that in a few ways. First, we step back and we see that by tracing nonprofits and looking at what's been going on for decades, you can notice things like the story of CSR and shareholder primacy actually had nonprofits at the very beginning of that. When you look to the 60s and 70s in the US, you can see that the first start of nonprofits trying to develop CSR principles on the ground in corporations in the US spurred kind of a reaction, including things like commissioned papers and responses, everything from Jensen and Meckling, Milton Friedman, the Powell Memo, and more. And so part of what we're seeing here is that often the nonprofits have an impact that may not be exactly the one that they were setting out to have, but they are having an impact. And sometimes it's setting forth an unpredictable chain reaction, but it's things that go to the very center of corporate governance debates. With the dynamics that we identify, we focus on a couple key ones that we think are going on. The first one is this chain reaction. And one thing that we notice about this is that it's not just like, oh, the pendulum swings, because often the reaction leads to a different status quo than what was the one in the first place. And it can also lead to forms of polarization. Snowballing wins and gradual hardening demands and legal challenges. So sometimes you see this with things like diversity rules for corporate boards or the supply chain legislation. So some of the advocacy can harden into real law around the world, but then those laws can get challenged, and then you end up with a new situation. There's also a hydraulic effect that seems to be occurring in some contexts, where there may be a debate about clamping down on one certain type of activity. In the US, for example, there's a hot debate going on about the shareholder proposal mechanism. And what we observe in this paper is, well, they don't just have that one strategy and they use others. So there's likely an implication that if you try to clamp down on the shareholder proposals, that the pressure, the things that are being exerted through the nonprofits isn't going to just go away. It will likely go to other activities. And you'd have to think about what are the costs and benefits of those things. There's also implications for comparative corporate governance. Mariana, of course, plays a strong role in this part of the paper. And I'll just highlight in the interest of time that one of the key things that we're identifying here is that with theories of things like convergence, they often didn't think about the role that nonprofits were playing in trying to shape corporate governance. And once you do, you can see that the nonprofits are often a force pushing against whatever convergence might otherwise happen towards a shareholder primacy a norm, because they are acting in counter response to that in somewhat unpredictable ways around the world. Normative implications. I imagine you'll want to talk about this in Q&A, which we'll get to very shortly. The focus of the paper largely isn't normative, but at the end we do say some things about the normative picture. And what we observe first is that you're not going to get from us this is good or this is bad, because anybody thoughtful approaching this, I think, would acknowledge that you're not going to be able to make those categorical assessments given the wide range of things we're looking at. But we do think there are some things that you could observe once you start to think systematically about this. For example, there's going to be different views on whether these nonprofits are helpful progress. That is, they are a force that shapes other interests coming into the corporate governance sphere, like stakeholder interests, et cetera. Or if you think the opposite, this is actually counterproductive and costly, and we should try to do something about that. We also observe that nonprofits present distinct agency problems and legitimacy issues because they don't have direct financial stakes in those targeted corporations. And there are reputational considerations that can mitigate this, but of course, those very features that we identified in part 1 about opacity, the risk of opportunistic or self-interested behavior that could be masked as advocacy for the public good, these are all there as well. And finally, these map onto, of course, greater debates. So sometimes people take the kind of quick response in thinking about how they might approach nonprofits, in thinking about how they think about the corporate debate, purpose debate more generally. So we hope that you will at least think that we have identified something worth studying, and they often are doing something different in the corporate governance sphere. Often nonprofits are working to broaden the set of interests being discussed, using a diverse playbook of strategies. This is transnational, and there's all sorts of dynamics that arise because of this. It makes for less predictable trajectories in the field, in part. So we hope that we've also opened a conversation about the normative implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now have Gen Goto from the University of Tokyo to provide the commentary.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So nice to see you all again. And also, I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Umakant and his team at NUS, for hosting this wonderful conference and also having me to discuss this very interesting paper. So I think I don't need to summarize, but I think this paper is the first in my knowledge, and also you suggested that this is the first to focus on the involvement of nonprofits in corporate governance. And I think nonprofits was elephant in the room for a long time, but has been neglected or treated as an anomaly. But this paper urges us to face it directly. And the authors also succeed in covering both pro-ESG and anti-ESG movements under one framework. So when I talked about nonprofits, I usually thought about the pro-ESG ones, but yes, at least in the US, you have anti-ESG, and this makes the whole picture more interesting. So I think this paper lays the groundwork for further analysis and on the roles of nonprofits. So it is a great paper. I urge you to read it if you haven't done so. But I have a few comments and questions. So one, so they describe the wide diversity of nonprofits, but it'll be interesting to see if there's any attribute that makes particular nonprofits more influential. One factor is the timing of creation. If you have long history with a good track record, you're likely to have a better reputation and a stronger influence. But I'm not so sure about the other factors. They point to purposes and or specialization, geography, whether it's better to have a general purpose to anything good for society, or is it better to have a specific purpose on climate change, human rights, DEI, or other stuff. And also, they talk more about the geographic reach, whether it's domestic or international, but maybe another factor is the geographic origin. If you come from US, you might be more influential or not, if you're European or from other parts of the world. So that's one question. And the reason of asking this question is that I think that not all nonprofits are successful. So there's one nonprofit which was active in Japan for several years, and it was successful enough to attract the attention of Dan. So the Kabunushi Ombudsman was very successful in filing many derivative suits against the Japanese corporations. But in 2019, ironically, after 7 years from Dan's paper, they decided to dissolve due to the passing away of one of his core members and also other members aged, which means that they failed to attract new generations. So why? Well, maybe this is just a Japanese phenomenon, but I think we need to look more into what leads to their durability. So second, maybe more analysis on lawsuits would be beneficial. So Elizabeth and Mariana talks about a couple of lawsuits in various jurisdictions. Some are successful, some are not. So what makes this difference? Is it the types of the claim or the types of the issues they are looking at, or whether it's validity of the logics, maybe jurisdiction? So there will be some other stuff. So I would urge you to dig more into the details. And talking about jurisdiction, they say that courts are reluctant to some extent to take up these lawsuits by nonprofits. Yes, they seem to be reluctant in the UK and also in the US. I think the Singapore is the same if I read the paper of Lulu correctly, but not in Poland, as you mentioned in your paper, and also not in Japan. So I have one paper on this typical case, but in Japan, courts usually would not go into the real intentions of the plaintiff, even if the nonprofit pursuing some other objective, as long as that institute is a shareholder and makes a valid claim, they would just take up and go into the substance. Well, I would not jump to the civil law versus common law divide here, but it looks like the case here. But so maybe it's just about how the procedural law is formulated. So I would just urge you to dig more into this. So third, why are we having anti-ESG nonprofits? So is this just a US phenomenon? Well, we all know that there's a cultural war in the US, but, and there are some extreme rights in many parts of the world, but I think that they are not involved that much in corporate governance yet. So I was just curious that why in the US, nonprofits are so active from anti-ESG side in corporate governance. And I was also wanted to know that whether your analysis in the part 1, talking about the why nonprofits are getting into corporate governance, is this intended to cover anti-ESG ones as well? It looks like that you're mostly talking about the pro-ESG ones. And now the hydraulic effect. So the authors suggest that suppressing a particular strategy would not work to limit the influence of nonprofits, as they will just move on to other strategies. You know, that may be true, but I think that all strategies are not equal. So they would have different impacts. So if one strategy is more effective than the others, then suppressing that effective one would not eliminate totally, but still could weaken the influence of nonprofits. So I might be a bit more cautious here, and maybe you could just look into what really happened when the SEC changed the rules, and especially in the U.S., because you say that the courts are quite reluctant to take up suits from nonprofits, then it might change the game. And also, they would, from this hydraulic effect, the authors suggest that maybe it's better to integrate nonprofits into more coherent corporate governance framework. Yes, it sounds nice, and I'd like to see that, but how you do that is a bigger problem. And this is my final main comment. So the authors also talk about the comparative corporate governance issues. Well, yes, sure. This is global corporate governance colloquium, so we have to talk about comparative corporate governance. But so they say that nonprofits have contributed to a new wave of global convergence. Yes, I agree that this is a new wave, but is there really a convergence here? I'm not so sure, because one thing is that jurisdictions are taking different approaches to ESG. US, now you have a big backlash. Europe seems to be still going toward pro-ESG. Asia, it's very diverse, according to Dan's paper as well, and Japan is still somehow in the middle. So, and also, are we having nonprofits active in Asia and Latin America? We mostly talk about nonprofits in US and Europe, but how are they doing in other parts of the world? Well, we have some in Japan, but definitely not in the scale of the US or Europe. So if you're going to expand your research, then I think you need to go more into those details in other countries. So I have some minor issues, but this is more about the litigation that I mentioned earlier. So again, this is a very great paper. And I think they opened up a new field, so I'm looking forward to see more developments in there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gen. Elizabeth, would you like a short reply, and then we'll start gathering questions.
Well, as we could all hear, that was excellent. Thank you so much again. So you gave us quite a lot, so I'll just be very brief, because I imagine many people have things to say too. I think that you're onto something interesting on the kind of the first couple points about not all are successful, and we don't mean to suggest that. And in fact, we've really thought a lot, and we've gotten many questions that are kind of at a higher level around like what works and what's successful. And we've really resisted saying that, in part because of the observation that we make that things play out over time in these unpredictable ways. And there might be some success in one litigation even, and then it gets overruled later as being unconstitutional, or it triggers this whole other set of nonprofits that take this other approach, like anti-ESG, for example, as you were noting. So that's just such a hard one in some ways, but I think the difficulty of that is part of the point in some sense, that we may not be able to say what's successful, but we can address some of the things that you're noting, which I very much hope to do. And then not all strategies are equal, I think, is another great point about the hydraulic effect. And it's hard to know that. I've seen a recent paper about what's happened with the shift in SEC policy, and it did have some impact, and it tilted the field a bit more towards the anti-ESG and anti-DEI and other nonprofits. So some of the effects can tilt towards one or the other, and I think we should acknowledge that as well. And maybe with the not more broader convergence, we should actually say that it's contributing to more diversity, because I think that is actually what we're seeing, and that's a precision point that we should try to get right. Thank you so much for all you said.
So we have a queue of 9 that is lined up. So what I would propose is maybe we take the first 5, and then you can have a chance to respond, then we'll take the next 4. So Lin, you have the first question.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Mariana, for this fascinating paper. I really enjoyed it. I have 2 questions. The first question is simple. Does business form and legal form matter for your framework? And in Asia, we have many non-for-profit organizations. They are organized as non-legal person, association, partnership, limited partnership, and also charitable trust. So does these non-legal person or some also legal person, different types of business form matter, and also affect their ability to litigate and make shareholder proposal? The second question is, does your proposed playbook or framework precondition or presupposed in a liberal democratic context with robust civil society protection? In Asia, for example, in China, in Singapore, non-for-profit organizations are operated under dual governance with the state. And ESG is taking a top-down approach. So I wonder whether your global trend or your proposal can also apply to these jurisdictions. Thank you.
Virginia?
Thanks. So my question follows very closely on Lin's. We know that historically, Anglo-US kind of model of corporate governance has been exported widely, and we can all think of examples. And a couple of days ago, we had a workshop on corporate scandals where we talked about the challenges of transplanting certain corporate governance elements without the institutional context. And so given your thoughts on the transnational role that many of these nonprofits play, I wonder if you could answer 2 questions. One is, how critical are UK and US-based NGOs and the institutional context that it facilitates them to global corporate governance dynamics that you describe in the paper? Or do you have thoughts about what are the institutional pieces that are kind of a minimum core of what would be needed to localize some form of corporate governance effect, even though there might be diversity? What would that look like in kind of a localized context? And I think that's kind of piggybacking off of Lin's question.
Thank you. Curtis?
Hi, thanks. Very interesting paper, Elizabeth and Mariana. My question goes to the concept of nonprofit. It's a very capacious concept in the United States. It's a tax distinction almost without regard to the purpose of the organization, so educational, political, et cetera. So I realize this is a lumping paper, but I think conceptually, I mean, to put it critically, you're stacking the deck in favor of quote-unquote nonprofit involvement in corporate governance. So an anti-ESG nonprofit it's a political action organization. I mean, to put it straight up. So I think it just conceptually be interesting or helpful for you to be a little bit more, draw more cleaner distinctions about what you're actually talking about and their influence.
This maybe follows on with what Curtis is saying. What I think is, for me, missing in the paper is an account of how the organizations are financed and who finances them. A membership, for example, that's an organization different from one that basically some rich person finances, or different yet again from one that a church group finances, and so I think that, and then the question further is, to the extent that the finances are shrouded, to what extent is that a specific concern? And so it seems to me that unless we have a better account of the motives of the parties who are engaging in their activity through the organizational form you identify, then there's a lot missing, right? So certainly in the U.S., to pursue this a little bit further, these organizations are basically designed to hide exactly who are the financial supporters. And so without piercing through that veil or peeking through that veil, we can't really appreciate necessarily the role that these organizations will play or intended to play even in the governance arena in which you're describing.
I'm wondering, how do we classify what they are doing? Is this an alternative route to some of the routes we were talking about, which is, I think, what you have in mind? Or are they just something that helps mechanisms that are in existence? So thinking about the US context, which is the one with which I'm familiar, what they do is they bring litigation and they bring shareholder proposals. They also lobby the government, but that's really outside corporate governance. So what that makes me think is those are things that individual investors could do. They don't do because of a free rider problem. They don't have, it's not worth it for them given their small stakes. And then those non-profits come and they have some stakes other than this, and then they essentially fund this. The reason why I think it matters is that this means that their ability to act, at least in the US, is based on the existence of the rights of individual shareholders. Those individual shareholders sometimes don't have the funding and then they step in. But that means, for example, that if we take SpaceX that came up for better or worse last time, if we don't have shareholder rights there, all the non-profits in the US are not going to make any difference. So in that respect, there wouldn't be an alternative mechanism for shareholder rights, but they really require robust shareholder rights to operate.
So Elizabeth, you can maybe take 2 to 3 minutes just to pick and choose what you want, or I can move on if you don't see a need to reply, but we'll have enough time.
Is there more on the queue?
There's 5 more.
Okay, there's only a few minutes, so I do have things to say, and at minimum I will say, this is exactly what we were hoping to have happen, is to get you thinking about this and make some of these points. And on the implications that I think Jeff and Curtis's points go to, and Lucian's as well, that some of these things about if we're stacking the deck and where the money comes from, we start to discuss in the implications, because I think that's where it becomes relevant, is maybe these differences matter for the normative implications, but they don't matter for the broader project of trying to understand what's going on. But they will matter in maybe how you think about the normative implications. And they may also, to your question, Lucian, about the individual and the collective and the strategies, I think it does help to see that maybe you could expect, though, that there will still be efforts at legislation the first category and the fourth category, because those things are still available and don't rely on the rights of shareholders. So I think there's some value in like looking at it systematically, because you can start to see where the playbook is. It might be less influence, but you could expect with a hydraulic, they'll put more effort on those things. And the normative implications of some of these are enormous, because some of what might be happening is that there may be big trade associations that we're familiar with, CII or Business Roundtable, et cetera, but the things that people don't agree on in those organizations splinter off into nonprofits that are opaque. We don't know exactly who's behind it, and they do the backlash against various things, or they do various other efforts. We don't fully understand those dynamics, but what we're pointing out is we should understand that that's part of this bigger picture of what's shaping the corporate governance. But I really will stop there so we can get the rest of the questions on the queue. And I also do very much see the institutional context and the international angle. That's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I could ask the remaining 5 to try to keep your questions short so Elizabeth had the chance. So Arjuna?
Thanks so much. Very, very interesting paper. So my comment actually builds a bit on Jeff's point earlier about the financiers. One thing I didn't see so much in the presentation in the paper was the structure of the market, essentially, of not-for-profits. And from my observations of this, at least with respect to ESG, is that you get this extreme concentration both across countries, but within countries, of who is financing this stuff. And I think that has implications for the way that you describe the phenomenon, insofar as I think there are some other, at least one other vehicle that maybe wasn't as clear in the paper, which is coordination, because it's not a fully competitive market, and that coordination across litigation, advocacy, and so on and so forth, I think is a really powerful part of this, and it may help illuminate a little bit the sort of pendulum effect that you describe.
So this follows up on Curtis's question. Since this is a taxonomy paper, I wonder if it's worth thinking more about the different sort of functional status of these nonprofits, right? So some nonprofits are long-term investors, and they're essentially using corporate governance in their capacity as investors. I think of Amelia Mazad's work on faith investors, right? The Catholic Church, or a university that pursues a divestment policy, right? So, you know, this is really sort of the classic investor with some sort of preference set, right? There are other nonprofits that are essentially advocates and are using corporate governance, buying into companies to fulfill or to further that advocacy role. And then there are nonprofits that are sort of coordinators, right? So they're playing a key role in corporate governance, but not acting themselves as stockholders at all. And As You Sow and the Center for Political Accountability might be examples of that. And I wonder, by sort of lumping it together, if you don't fully expose the at least potential legitimacy questions that might differ among those different functions.
Jennifer?
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was great. My question is just how you see this paper as fitting in with your corporate governance machine paper. Do you see it as just having a greater nuance, deep dive into what the tensions are within the corporate governance machine? Do you see it expanding? I mean, I thought the corporate governance machine was very US focused, so is this an expansion into the transnational area? Or is it kind of a competing model to the corporate governance machine?
Tobias?
Fascinating paper. One suggestion how to conceptualize the impact and the success story or the failure. So I think strategies that push for a subset of actors acting out of equilibrium are typically unsuccessful in a competitive environment, because then others take up the slack and equilibrium doesn't change. And related to that, what you also may want to look at is what are all these activities and strategies that are pursued largely in the US and Europe what's their impact on a global scale? Because that, if you believe in that waterbed thing, then you would probably think that much of that migrates actually out of the space that we can control to state-owned enterprises or private firms that are not so much subject to that kind of pressure. So therefore, I think that's one way of conceptualizing the impact that you're looking at.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I understand the paper in the following way, that we have here a double-edged mechanism. So non-profit form reduces distrust in some contexts, but it can also launder private interests through the appearance of public purpose. And so Jill suggested to look at the functional status. I wonder whether it would be useful to look at the behavioral, because it's a behavioral mechanism, to look at the behavioral role. And I try to think about it, and you have different categories here: trust intermediaries, norm entrepreneurs, attention entrepreneurs, and I think they work by Lior, something on that, identity mobilizers, litigation vehicles. So it's just like using this sort of not necessarily functional, but more, I think, behavioral role. Yeah.
Asaf?
So maybe moving a bit to the normative part and taking on one of the points that you mentioned, should we see the kind of cooperative kind of outcome, is that like a bug or a feature, right? If I'm a shareholder and I care about, I'm inspired by the corporate governance machine and I care about profits, maybe the way to think about it is to say, you can be a non-profit, you can have whatever you want, but you need to have at least 3% of shareholders that are willing to support your cause before we let you, put forward a proposal, file for litigation, or something like that, right?
Thank you. So I just want to add a little bit more to multiple comments that have gone in the same direction. So you have very coarse classification. You have for-profit, non-profit. I would say, first, for-profit, that's a very homogeneous category. Everyone is motivated by one thing, making money. Non-profit, that's in many ways a misnomer. It's everything else. And so you really need to go into what motivates people to go into the non-profit sector. Why do people choose to work for As You Sow rather than for JP Morgan? And I think that's another route into getting at the massive heterogeneity under the umbrella non-profit, and very, very much in line with what Jeff said. He was, more concretely looking at, where's the funding coming from. But I think also important is, why do people choose to go into that sector?
So
thank you.
A wonderful sign of a great
Nothing?
paper, but we're out of time.
Yeah, okay.
13 questions, but you
I will say
you can have 60 seconds.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. Well, I would say a few things, and it won't be exactly probably what Mariana would say, so we'll put our heads together too, of course. Some of this is actually in the paper, and in 15 minutes I can't present it all. Coordinating effects and other things we talk about, maybe not as much as we could. We give lots of things airtime in the length of a law review article, but here today I can't do everything. But some of it is asking for things of different ways of classifying, and it's not actually a taxonomy paper, though we do try to make headway in understanding this big, very broad universe. And we do a bit of tying it to the normative implications, but that's where I think the most purchase lies in thinking about which categories actually matter for then the normative implications. I think that's one way in to making some headway in thinking about the classifications. And the corporate governance machine. So when I worked on that was taking a U.S. perspective on public company governance. And so when Mariana came to me and wanted to work on this, she said, do you want to work on a paper on NGOs? I was like, what? And I was like, well, nonprofits? Okay, yeah, because you're exactly right. This is a very big thing that we have not studied. And I hope that it will lead to many more papers. But in this regard, I hoped to at least add that I don't think the nonprofits are in the machine in the US. They're the ones outside the machine. And that's part of why I wanted to do this project, because I think it gives a more complete picture of what's shaping for-profit corporate governance. And when I work with Mariana, of course, and when we wanted to study this topic properly, we had to look outside the US because they do act in transnational ways, coordinating and doing other things. So that helps us better understand maybe what's happening other places, but also what's happening in the US. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.